So ego, that's a tricky one. What is ego? Well, first of all, let's clear a few assumptions from the air. Ego is nothing to do with Americans. Often in Finland, when you use the word ego, people immediately think of having a big ego equals being arrogant or being in some way culturally looking at yourself as better than others. Well, let's look at ego as something actually from a communication point of view as neutral. You could say it's identity. It's very close to the idea of identity. So identity happens by comparison. You have to look at the differences between this and that to create an identity. So if you look at the differences, you're going to be saying, for example, I am better than somebody, or somebody might talk about this person being better than others, but also worse than others. So anytime that you have a comparison, for better or for worse, you're looking at ego. In human dynamics, it's basically most of the time. So nothing wrong with ego because it's just identity, it's neutral. I'll add the word neutral here because it's often misunderstood. But then if we look at ego, there's a number of levels at which ego plays out. And the problem with ego is that people often don't know how to use the ego, how to use their identity. First of all, how to create it, look after it, but also deal with other people's ego. So let's look at it from the 4 levels and unpack it. First of all, the physical level. So the physical level of ego, you could think about it as your body, but let's take the metaphor of a car for a second. So let's say that your ego is a vehicle, just to make the metaphor. And let's say that you're going from point A to point B. If you have a car, it's going to be quicker, possibly safer, drier to go from A to B with a car. But if you don't, you'll get there anyway, but it's just going to be more tedious. So with a car, you get there. And the same thing goes with the ego. From a social perspective, if you're trying to socialize with people and you have a healthy, think of it as a car that is in good condition, you're going to be having a better time socializing than if you don't have an ego. The problem is not the ego. The problem is what happens when you get home. So imagine you get home and you get to the garage and that you actually identify to the car. Think of, those young guys who've just got a car from daddy and who think that they are the car. What happens when the car goes in the garage? Two possibilities. Does the person think that they are the car, and in which case they will start polishing the car and the whole evening look at the car, admire the car, send photos on social media of the car and so on and so on? Or are they able to put the car in the garage, close the key and go home and forget about the car until the following time that they need it? And you could call that detachment. The detachment ability. It doesn't mean you have to always be detached. It just means that it's possible. So in other words, if you are able to detach from your ego, then it's serving its purpose. If you're not, then you're stuck with it. You're stuck in it. And so from a physical level, you could think about it as your body. Of course, the body is the obvious physical ego. I mean, I identify by having a better or worse body than somebody else. That's physical ego. That could, of course, be other physical attributes like gender, sexuality, disability, age. All of those things are physical ego. So somebody who identifies to their gender, their age, their geographical origin, their nationality, all of those things are physical ego. And they're fine. They're absolutely wonderful things because they're your identity. But the problem starts if you're not able to park that car in the garage and go home and not spend the whole night polishing the car. And the only way that we've found so far as a reliable sign of being able to detach from the ego is humor. And a sense of humor is not the same as irony, by the way, because often people say, well, I can laugh at myself, but actually it's irony. Irony is a form of defense. So if it's wholehearted humor, as in I'm able to laugh at myself without it being a form of defense, then you are basically free from your ego and you can use it without it being so destructive to others and to yourself. Still having a very comfortable and strong identity. Good example of that is if you look back at the video of the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu, who are potentially two of the biggest spiritual egos in this planet. they're still able to laugh at themselves and each other on a live video stream where they're first laughing at the physical ego, then laughing at the emotional ego, then they're laughing at each other at the intellectual ego, which is their ideas, and then they're laughing at their spiritual positions. And they're still doing that by claiming their identity, but they're able to detach from it. So think of humor not as just something entertaining, but humor is a rather interesting way to see what people are doing at the ego level as well. So let's look at the different levels. If physical ego is gender, age, nationality, body type, and so on, emotional ego is going to be often very present with creative people, artists, designers, or musicians who identify through the feelings that they have or that they trigger with other people. So for instance, you'll hear people say that I'm better than others because my music is healing the world, or I'm worse than others because nobody knows me and I'm not famous as an artist, or so on and so on. So emotional ego is about the feelings that you trigger in yourself and others. Intellectual ego is the one that everybody first thinks of when we think of ego. So intellectual ego is, of course, your intellectual ability, your IQ. You'll get emails from people saying like, test your IQ, are you better or worse than me? Academics will look at ego through how many publications they have in journals. Work people will be looking at how much experience they have in a particular company, how many years experience. Or startups will look at how many buyouts and how many startups have they created. So all that is intellectual ego. And the most difficult ego to deal with is, of course, the spiritual ego. Spiritual ego is when you identify to your spiritual beliefs, and that could mean anybody, including a pragmatic person who would claim to not be spiritual, because pragmatism is the love of wisdom. It's one spiritual position amongst many others. So a pragmatic engineer who identifies to themselves as being a pragmatic person and goes from belief and principle, everything should be pragmatic, is equally trapped in their spiritual ego than a religious fundamentalist who is saying that everybody should believe in the same God. So without placing right or wrong labels here, spiritual ego is the most difficult to detach from because it's taken very, very seriously by people. So think of it now as a mirror. If you look at your own self, you'll have, like everybody, a number of levels of ego which are not easily able to be detached from. So, and that's fine. It's just to be aware of them helps you to know. In other words, where are you not able to laugh at yourself is where you have ego that is not detached. And being able to detach from your ego doesn't mean you have to detach from it all the time. It means that you might sometimes have to take it very seriously to do a job, but then the ability to detach later is what counts, so that you're not identifying to that part of yourself. It's just a vehicle, just like the physical vehicle. You have an emotional vehicle, an intellectual vehicle, and a spiritual ego vehicle. Now, because this is very abstract and quite philosophical, what we did is we created a set of ego cards, which have got a number of typical ego positions that people take with regards to communication at work. And these ego cards kind of playfully look at the dark side and the good side of each ego position. So, and it combines all of those 4 levels. So just to make it easier, I would recommend that you would start looking at those and start to think about them in your own working life before you look at these 4. But if you want to go deeper, of course, this is a great journaling exercise to look at and think deeply, where am I attached to my ego at these 4 levels? So ego, a neutral thing, and it's a very important part of social interactions. The only problem is when somebody is taking themselves too seriously at one of those different levels of ego.